Hello and welcome, fasten your seatbelts. In the short promo, I want to offer one way to look at geopolitics through simple cartoon-style illustrations that capture key ideas in a very compact form, with short comments instead of long theory. We will move from the late 19th century to today and review key theories of geopolitics, looking at both major thinkers and the broader schools they shaped. We'll start with classical geopolitics in its Anglo-American and Central European versions, then turn to the French school that contributed to the post-war revival of geopolitical thinking from the 1970s, and finally to critical geopolitics. I will briefly come back to each of these traditions later in this video and explain what they mean in practice. There are two directions: classical geopolitics, where territory seems to act like a set of natural laws, and critical geopolitics, which asks how people, media, and institutions construct those laws through perceptions and narratives. What exactly is geopolitics? Back in the 1940s, Nicholas Spiegelman noticed that people used geopolitics in three ways: as an expansionist doctrine, as a near synonym for political geography, or as geographically informed security planning. Here are two more angles of defining geopolitics: a set of geographical factors shaping policy, and shared spatial ideas that justify political interests in the real world. To introduce classical geopolitics, we begin with Alfred Thayer Mahan, a US naval officer and historian of sea power, whose ideas strongly influenced British and American strategy. His core idea is that maritime powers have a geopolitical edge over land powers because they can move trade and force more flexibly. What must a sea power do to keep that advantage? First, keep a strong modern navy. Second, maintain a network of support ports and coaling stations globally. Third, take a leading role in keeping sea trade open and reliable. Fourth, secure key choke points, straits and canals so your routes stay open. Next is Halford Mackinder, scholar, politician, sometime diplomat, who shifted attention from oceans to the last landmass of Eurasia. Unlike Mahan, he worried that land powers held strategic advantages. The main advantage, in his view, was the inward strength of the heartland, a vast zone in Eurasia. The heartland is a giant geopolitical fortress, hard to attack from the outside, but a useful resource base. Mackinder's famous summary was: "Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world." While heartland was hard to attack from the outside, it was rich in fuel, metals, wheat and cotton, and increasingly tied together by railways. In his view, that combination made the heartland both a secure resource base and a potential springboard for power over the wider world island. In his view, that combination made the heartland both a secure resource base and a potential springboard for power over the wider world island. Norway. Now we move to Friedrich Ratzel, a German geographer and ethnographer who introduced the central idea of the state as an organism tied to its territory. Ratzel described the state as an organism, not just a government on a map, but a living web of people, infrastructure and territory, a kind of superorganism similar to a beehive, an ant colony, or a coral reef, where individual units make sense only as part of the whole. He thought this organism could become a higher form when population, culture, or political ideas bind people tightly to their space. The more numerous the population, the more links it has to the land, the more its survival is rooted in that territory. A growing population, Ratzel argued, seeks new space, and expanding cultural and political influence prepares the ground for territorial expansion. State organisms compete for vital space, Lebensraum in German, and successful ones are those that manage to expand it. It is important that at first this expansion is presented as economic and cultural, rather than purely military, which makes the idea sound more neutral and respectable. Still, this idea carries a strong potential for colonial and expansionist interpretations. Rudolf Chellan, the Swedish scholar you see here, coined the term geopolitics. He divided the study of the state into geopolitics, ecopolitics, demopolitics, sociopolitics, and cratopolitics, meaning society, power, economy, and territory as interconnected dimensions. Here Chellan introduces a further classification: topopolitics, physiopolitics, morphopolitics, and biopolitics. Technical labels for different ways at looking at the state, from its life processes to the shape of its territory, its physical environment, and its position in space. Here we meet Karl Haushofer, a German officer and scholar who popularized geopolitics between the world wars. Adopting Ratzel's idea of Lebensraum, Haushofer portrayed post-World War I Germany as cramped and unjustly confined, in need of eastward expansion. Here you see how Hitler took that language of unjust borders and living space and used it to legitimize his aggressive conquest in Eastern Europe. But instead of Haushofer's preferred alliance with the USSR, Nazi Germany attacked the USSR to seize new territory. The last thinker from the classical tradition we meet is Nicholas Spiegelman. Born in the Netherlands, he spent most of his career in the United States at Yale, where he co-founded and directed the Yale Institute for International Studies. Spiegelman is best known for his idea of the Rimland, the coastal belt around Eurasia, which he treated as more important than Mackinder's heartland. Spiegelman elevates Rimland to the main theta, arguing it has better transport, larger populations, and strong agriculture than the heartland. He adapted Mackinder's quote: "Who rules the Rimland commands the world island." Now let's proceed with the post-World War II geopolitics. After World War II, geopolitics as a term fell out of favor for several reasons that you can probably guess. One key reason: the alleged influence of Haushofer's geopolitics on Nazi policy made the whole field look morally compromised. Geopolitical ideas were widely blamed for helping to legitimize the catastrophic violence of the war. Another reason was technical. Once nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles appeared, traditional ideas of defensible terrain seemed much less relevant. By the late 1970s, though, geopolitics returns, this time as a media buzzword used by journalists to describe almost any conflict over space and influence. Now we turn to the French school, looking mainly at its development from the 1970s onwards, when French authors helped rehabilitate the term geopolitics while reworking and updating earlier French geographical traditions. These earlier French geographers rejected hard geographic determinism and insisted that humans are not simply prisoners of their environment. Vidal de la Blanche possibilism argued that geography sets constraints, but within those limits, people still have real choices about how to act. Also, some emphasize that geopolitics is not only about rivalry and conflict. Cooperation and interdependence matter too. Here we move to Yves Lacoste, a left-leaning French geographer who played a major role in rehabilitating geopolitics in the 1970s and 1980s. He founded the journal Hérodote and later the French Institute of Geopolitics. Among other things, Lacoste stressed how school maps and textbooks shape the way ordinary people imagine the world long before they read strategic analysis. He also argued that geopolitical processes, such as rivalries, unfold at many levels, from local to regional to global, and the same event can look very different depending on the scale you choose. For Lacoste, geopolitics doesn't stop at state borders. It can be used to think about electoral districts, city neighborhoods, or even gang-controlled territories. Lacoste also argued that changing the time frame of analysis can reveal very different trends. So serious geopolitical thinking must balance long-term structures with short-term crises. And now let's proceed to critical geopolitics. It argues that geopolitics is not a set of fixed geopolitical laws, but a set of constructed subjective ideas and cultural stories that people create to justify power and policy choices. Geopolitical representations, maps, spheres of interests are not neutral. They usually advance the interests of powerful states and elites, often imperial and historically mostly male. Theories must be read through the author's biography, the historical context, and the power of dissemination that makes some ideas influential and others not. Critical geopolitics criticizes the classical tradition's love of binaries, sea powers versus land powers or geopolitical ally versus geopolitical enemy. All of this leaves little room for a mixed or balanced position in between. Also, critical geopolitics talks about three different models of geopolitical thinking: scholarly, policy-oriented, and popular, rather than just one model. Finally, I feel myself obliged to mention Gerard Toll, an Irish-born political geographer who has worked for many years in the United States. Since the 1990s, his book Critical Geopolitics and Later Studies have helped to define this field. He stands for that last turn in our story, asking who draws the maps, who tells the stories, and who benefits from them. Whew. That was a high-speed tour of the history of geopolitical thought. If you want to learn more, join me on Udemy. All these visuals and many more come from the full course waiting for you there. See you!